For 20 years, my name, Jonathan Vance, was a synonym for power, a name whispered in boardrooms and government halls with a mixture of reverence and fear. My empire was not built on innovation or charm. It was built on the cold, hard currency of absolute control. Every rival, every market shift, every political tremor, I saw it coming, and I mastered it. The world was just an intricate chessboard, and I had long ago crowned myself its king. I had everything a man could want: skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, a fortune that could alter the fates of nations, and influence that reached into the darkest corners of the globe. And yet I had absolutely nothing he truly needed. But for all my foresight, for all my meticulous, suffocating control, I never foresaw her. She was a little girl, maybe 10 years old, perched on a park bench in the middle of my company's ostentatious annual charity gala. The contrast was jarring. Around her, a universe of tailored tuxedos and glittering diamonds swirled, a maelstrom of calculated smiles and hollow laughter. She was an island of stillness in that turbulent sea. She was holding a photograph, clutching it with a solemnity that did not belong in this place of frivolous wealth. It was a faded, dog-eared, utterly impossible photograph of my dead wife, Evelyn. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, refusing to move. The impossibly thin champagne flute in my hand, once feather-light, suddenly felt like it weighed a ton, threatening to shatter under an entirely internal pressure. The world, once a grand symphony I conducted with a mere flick of my wrist, went profoundly and terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the frantic, chaotic pounding in my chest. It was a picture of my Evelyn, taken 5 years after she was buried beneath 6 feet of cold earth, and a mountain of my unresolved grief. And as that impossible, world-shattering fact crashed over me, for the first time in 2 decades, my legs, the very pillars that had held up my unassailable world, began to tremble. The gala was in full, nauseating swing, a glittering circus of wealth and influence staged across the meticulously manicured gardens of my sprawling estate. Senators, whose careers I could make or break with a single phone call, were laughing heartily with tech moguls whose companies I could acquire on a whim. Acclaimed artists, whose work was a mystery to me, clinked glasses with ruthless bankers who understood my language. I moved through them all, a wraith in a bespoke suit, feeling as though I owned the very ground they stood on. Which, of course, I did. It was a performance, a role I had inhabited and perfected since Evelyn passed. Smile, shake a hand, project an air of invulnerability. It was a shield, anything to hide the cavernous hollowness that had been carved into my chest the day I lost her. A void that no amount of money or power could ever hope to fill. Evelyn. My Evelyn. The name itself was a memory, a ghost on my tongue. She was a brilliant, fiery artist who saw the world in vibrant, chaotic colors. At the same time, I was busy reducing it to black and white profit margins. Our love story was the kind that scandalized high society, a delicious piece of gossip for the elite to chew on. A white billionaire, the designated heir to a cold, industrial dynasty, falling for a fiercely independent black painter from a world they didn't know or care to understand. My family was openly appalled. Her friends were deeply suspicious. We faced down the thinly veiled racism that dripped from condescending headlines and the icy shoulders at every social gathering. One evening, my own father had taken me aside and, with a chilling lack of emotion, stated that my infatuation was a biological and financial liability to the Vance legacy. In response, we built a fortress for 2, a vibrant, loving world where none of their poison could touch us. And for 15 glorious years, it was our sanctuary. Then, a sudden illness, a brutal, swift decline, and she was gone. The fortress crumbled into dust, leaving only me shivering in the ruins. I'd spent the next 20 years encasing her memory in amber. In my mind, I curated her. She became perfect, saintly, stripped of her human complexities. I chiseled away her frustrations, her moods, her beautiful imperfections, until she was a flawless idol I worshipped in the sterile, echoing silence of our mansion. The story I told myself, and by extension the world, was simple, clean, and tragic. It was a lie, of course, a lie of omission, but a comforting one. It was a story I could control. And then I saw the girl. She was sitting on a wrought iron bench near the rose garden Evelyn had personally designed, a sanctuary within a sanctuary, situated far enough from the main crowd to be an act of deliberate separation. She was a small, serious child, with large, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her with quiet intensity. She was clutching that worn photograph as if it were a holy relic, a lifeline. I stopped dead in my tracks, a statue amidst the flowing river of guests. From 100 feet away, the setting sunlight caught the image just right. A final golden ray that illuminated a face I knew better than my own. It was Evelyn, her smile just as radiant and full of mischievous life as I remembered. But she wasn't alone. Her arm was wrapped lovingly around a young woman I'd never seen before, a woman who looked strikingly like the little girl on the bench. And Evelyn, my God, Evelyn looked older. The lines around her eyes were deeper, etched by laughter and time I never knew she had. There was a touch of silver in her dark, beautiful hair. That wasn't the woman who had died in my arms 20 years ago. My mind, a finely tuned machine for data and logic, raced, trying to process the information. Still, it was like forcing a supercomputer to accept that 2 plus 2 equals 5. It was impossible. An error, a ghost in the machine. My security chief, Marcus, a stoic and unflappable man who'd been my shadow for 30 years, noticed my sudden paralysis. He materialized at my side, his voice a low, concerned rumble. "Sir, is everything all right?" I couldn't form words. My entire vocabulary of command and control had abandoned me. I just pointed, my hand unsteady, a shocking betrayal from a limb that had signed billion-dollar contracts without a tremor. That girl, on the bench. Who is she? Marcus followed my gaze, his professional eyes scanning the scene. He was the only person who had seen the depth of my grief after Evelyn's death. The only one who knew the performance was just that. "Not sure, sir," he replied, his tone even. "Her name tag says Amira. She's with one of the community outreach groups we sponsor annually, St. Jude's Youth Center. Her guardian must be one of the chaperones mingling nearby." I felt myself being pulled toward her, a gravitational force stronger than any ambition, more compelling than any deal I'd ever closed. Every rule of my carefully constructed world, every instinct honed over decades of calculated detachment, screamed at me to stay back. Send Marcus. Handle it with quiet, detached precision. Dispatch the problem. But my feet were already moving, carrying me across the manicured lawn, away from the glittering, hollow lies of the gala, and toward a terrifying, unknown, and potentially world-ending truth. My approach was clumsy, a stark contrast to my usual calculated and intimidating style. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a general walking onto a battlefield without his armor. The little girl looked up as my shadow fell over her, her large eyes widening a bit, not with fear, but with a child's frank curiosity at the sight of the tall man whose face was plastered on all the banners around the garden. An older woman with a gentle, weary face and a simple cardigan, who had been sitting on a nearby bench, immediately stood up, placing herself subtly between us. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but unmistakably guarded. She was a sentry at the gate. "Forgive me," I stammered, my own voice sounding alien and strained in my ears. I gestured ineptly toward the photo clutched in the girl's hands. "That picture. May I please see it?" The word please felt foreign on my tongue. I was a man who gave orders, who made demands. I didn't ask. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, the girl's foster mother, placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder. The girl, Amira, clutched the photo even tighter to her small chest, her knuckles white. "It's very special to her," Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "It was her mother's. Her mother's." The two words hung in the charged air between us, heavy and dense. I looked at Amira then, really looked at her, past the impossible photo and into her face, her wide, intelligent eyes, the specific curve of her smile, even in its current subdued state. There was a faint, undeniable echo of Evelyn in her features, both breathtakingly beautiful and excruciatingly painful. It was a ghost of a resemblance, but it was there. My voice dropped to barely a whisper, stripped of all its power and authority. "Please, it is imperative." Sarah must have seen the raw, unmasked desperation in my eyes, a look I'm sure no one, not my rivals, not my board, not even my own family, had ever seen on my face. She relented. She murmured something soft and reassuring to Amira, who, after a long moment of childish hesitation, shyly held out the photograph. My hands trembled when I took it. It was real, tangible. The paper was old, the corners softened with time and handling, the colors faded from sun or age, and there she was, Evelyn, looking to be in her late 40s, her face full of a serene happiness I hadn't seen since the early years of our marriage. She looked healthy and vibrant. The woman beside her was a younger version of Amira, her smile bright and untroubled. This had to be Maya. And on the back, in Evelyn's elegant, familiar handwriting, a script I knew as well as my own signature, were the words, "My Maya, my sunshine." Lakeview, 1999. 1999, my blood ran cold. The warmth of the summer evening vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill that seeped into my bones. Evelyn died in the spring of 1994. I had stood by her graveside. I had received the condolences. I had lived 20 years in the shadow of that date. The strength just evacuated my body. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the wrought iron bench beside Amira, the billionaire titan collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. The noise of the gala, the music, the laughter, the schmoozing, faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. The entire foundation of my life, the carefully constructed story of my great love and tragic grief, the very memory of the woman I loved. It had all just been dynamited, and I was standing at ground zero. "Who is Maya?" I asked, my voice strained, tight. "She was my mom," Amira said softly, her voice small but clear. "She passed away last year. She told me this was my grandmother, Evelyn. She said she was an angel who painted the sky. Grandmother. The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the last of the air from my lungs. Evelyn had a daughter she had never once mentioned to me, a daughter she was meeting with, being photographed with in secret, 5 years after the entire world, including her own husband, thought she was dead. I couldn't process it. My brain, so adept at navigating hostile takeovers and complex financial models, was completely short-circuiting. The logic was gone. There was only the raw, screaming contradiction. I handed the photo back to Amira, my movements stiff, robotic. I managed to thank them, a hollow, meaningless gesture that tasted like ash in my mouth. I turned and walked back toward the mansion, each step feeling like I was wading through deep, heavy water. I blew past Marcus's concerned questions, his face a mask of worry. I walked through the glittering sea of my guests, their fake smiles and empty chatter now looking grotesque and absurd. I reached the sanctuary of my study, locked the heavy oak doors behind me, and leaned against them, finally alone with the wreckage. The room was my fortress, all dark wood, leather-bound books I'd never read, and silence. On the mantelpiece, in a heavy silver frame, was the last photo ever taken of Evelyn and me. She was 42, vibrant, beautiful, a week before the diagnosis that supposedly ended her life. The woman in Amira's photo was someone else, someone who had lived a whole life I knew nothing about. Was our life a lie? Our fortress for two? Did it have a secret door all along? A hidden escape hatch I never knew existed? Sleep was an impossibility that night. The hours stretched into an eternity of silent questions. Just before dawn, I picked up the phone. I called my most trusted private investigator, a man named Harris, a ghost himself, a man who could find anything or anyone, no matter how deep they were buried. I gave him a name, Maya, a place, Lakeview, and a year, 1999. "Find everything," I commanded, my voice raw, broken. "I want to know every breath she ever took." And Harris? No one can know about this. No one. The next few days were a blur of sustained, gut-wrenching tension. I went through the motions of running my global empire, attending meetings and making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But my mind was elsewhere. It was stuck in a dark, winding maze of questions, replaying the image of that faded photograph over and over. My board members, a pack of sharks who can smell blood in the water at the slightest sign of weakness, noticed my distraction. During a tense negotiation over a new acquisition, I lost my train of thought. A lapse so uncharacteristic, it caused a visible ripple of unease around the table. My younger brother, Robert, who had spent his entire life a resentful step behind me in business and a million miles behind in character, saw his opening. At a mandatory family dinner, he made a snide remark, his voice dripping with faux concern. "You seem off, Jonathan," he said, a familiar glint of opportunism in his eye. "Finally feeling your age? It happens to us all. Perhaps it's time to let the next generation take on a little more responsibility." He was circling, sensing a potential power vacuum. I just ignored him, the barb bouncing off the thick armor of my obsession. The cryptic daily updates from Harris consumed my thoughts entirely. The first thread he pulled was a birth certificate from a dusty county archive. Maya Johnson was born in 1972. Mother, Evelyn Croix. Father, unknown. 1972. That was 3 years before I even met Evelyn. She was a young, struggling artist back then, living in a tiny apartment, a life she had painted for me in broad, romantic strokes. She told me stories about that time, but they were curated, edited for my consumption. She never once mentioned a child. The lie of omission began to feel less like a comforting blanket and more like a deliberate, suffocating shroud. Harris's subsequent research painted a grim, heartbreaking picture. Evelyn, alone, barely out of her teens, and crushingly poor, had given her daughter up for a closed adoption. A clean break, or so she must have thought. The next piece of the puzzle came from a retired social worker Harris tracked down in Florida, a woman who, after some persuasion, remembered the case. She told Harris that a desperate young Evelyn had returned a year after the adoption, begging to reverse it. But it was too late. The law was absolute. The records were sealed. A dead end. Evelyn, she said, had been utterly devastated. But that still didn't explain the photograph. How did she find her daughter decades later? And the central, horrifying question that kept me awake at night. How could she have been alive in 1999? My mind, my logical, rational mind, refused to go where the evidence was pointing. The alternative, the idea that Evelyn had faked her own death and abandoned me, was a betrayal so monstrous I couldn't bear even to formulate the thought. Driven by an urgency, I couldn't explain, a need to connect with the only living link to this mystery. I went to see Amira and Sarah again. I didn't go as Jonathan Vance, the billionaire. I left the armor behind. I went as a man searching for a ghost. I found them at their modest but clean apartment building, a world away from the cold, palatial emptiness of my mansion. I brought a portfolio of Evelyn's early charcoal sketches. Raw, powerful pieces from before she met me. Things I'd never shown another soul. "I want to tell you about Evelyn," I said, my voice stripped of its usual authority, standing on their welcome mat like a supplicant. For the first time, Sarah's guard seemed to come down completely. Amira's eyes lit up with an incandescent curiosity. I sat with them in their small, sunlit living room, a room filled with more warmth and life than my entire estate. And I just talked. I told them how Evelyn would hum, slightly off-key, when a painting was going well. I told them about her irrational love for sunflowers, how she filled our home with them. I recounted the time she convinced me to ditch a G7 summit in Paris to go camping in the Pyrenees instead. A story of impulsiveness and joy that felt like it belonged to another man's life. I showed Amira the sketches, and her small fingers traced the charcoal lines with a reverent sense of wonder. My mom said Grandma Evelyn taught her how to see the magic in ordinary things, Amira shared, her voice soft. She said she could find a story in a puddle of water on the street. The three of us sat there for hours, bonding over the memory of a woman we had all loved. But it was becoming clear we all knew a different version of her. We were piecing together a mosaic, and the image emerging was complex and tragic. During one visit, I gently asked Amira about the photograph again. "Mom gave it to me right before she got really sick," she explained, her expression turning somber. She said it was the only picture she had of them together. They met at a special place, a house by a lake. Mom said Grandma Evelyn would sometimes visit her there. It was their secret. A house by a lake. Lakeview. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture I honestly, desperately didn't want to see. Then, late one night, Harris called. His voice was grim, heavy. "Jonathan, you need to sit down." "I'm already sitting, Harris." "What is it?" I demanded, my patience worn to a thread. There was a pause, and then the words that would bring my world crashing down. "The woman who died in the clinic in 1994. It wasn't Evelyn." The world just tilted on its axis. The phone felt slippery in my hand. "What are you talking about, Harris?" "I was there." I held her hand as she slipped away. I buried her. I delivered the eulogy. The words came out as a desperate, rasping defense of my own memory, of my own sanity. "I know," Harris said gently, his tone softening in the face of my disbelief. "I've been digging into the hospital records from the private clinic, the death certificate. Everything looked clean on the surface. Too clean, almost sterile. But then I cross-referenced the dental records from Evelyn's old checkup before you were married. They don't match the post-mortem records from '94. It's not a match, Jonathan. It's not even close." He kept going, his words precise, clinical, and utterly devastating. "I found a source. An old nurse who worked at the private clinic back then. She's retired in Arizona, scared for her life even after all these years. But she talked. There was another woman there at the same time, a distant cousin of Evelyn's who bore a striking resemblance to her. She was terminally ill, had no family to speak of, and no money. Jonathan, your family arranged it." My family. The word tasted like acid in my mouth. My father, Arthur, my brother, Robert. "The nurse said Evelyn was terrified," Harris went on, his voice a low monotone as he relayed the horror. "Your family's opposition to the marriage hadn't gone away. It had festered, gotten worse. They saw her as a permanent threat to the Vance dynasty, to the bloodline. When she finally reconnected with her daughter, Maya, they saw it as another scandal waiting to happen. This complication could tarnish the name, so they gave Evelyn an ultimatum. The terrible, unimaginable truth finally crashed down on me, cold and sharp as shards of broken glass. I could finally see the whole, monstrous picture. "They made her disappear," I whispered, the realization sucking the air from the room. "Yes," Harris confirmed. "They staged her death, paid off the clinic administrator, the doctor on call faked the records, and switched her with her dying cousin in the final hours. They gave Evelyn a new identity, a passport, and access to a significant amount of offshore money. But it came with one unbreakable condition. She could never contact you again. They told her that if she ever tried, they would use the full weight of their power to ruin not only you, but to make sure her daughter, Maya, would suffer for it. They would have destroyed the new life Maya was building. Evelyn chose to protect you both by vanishing. The betrayal was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest, suffocating me. It wasn't just Evelyn's secret. It was my family's, my father, my brother. They knew. They had orchestrated the theft of my life, of my love. For 20 years I had mourned a lie. I had built a sterile shrine to a woman who was alive, a woman forced into the shadows, spending her last years stealing precious, secret moments with the daughter she'd been forced to give away, all while I sat alone on my throne of cold, useless money. Evelyn hadn't betrayed me. She had sacrificed herself for me, and for her child. The grief I felt in that moment was new and violent. It wasn't the quiet, dignified grief for a life well lived and tragically cut short. It was a raging, roaring grief for a life that was stolen, for a love that was murdered by my own blood. My perfect amber-encased memory of her shattered into a million pieces. In its place was the raw, terrifying image of a woman I loved, backed into a corner, making an impossible, soul-destroying choice. The next family dinner was a tribunal. I walked into my father's house, the cold, imposing mansion I grew up in, and the air was thick with a guilt so palpable I could taste it. My father, Arthur Vance, a man who looked like he was carved from granite and hubris, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table. Robert smirked at me as I entered, utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I dropped a thick file on the table. It slid across the polished surface and came to a stop in front of my father. It contained everything from Harris: the birth certificate, the dental record analysis, the nurse's sworn, notarized statement. 1999, I said, my voice dangerously calm, the voice I used just before destroying a rival company. Lakeview. Explain it. My father's face, usually a mask of stern control, went white. Robert's smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of bewildered confusion. Jonathan, you don't understand, my father began, his ironclad voice failing him for the first time I could ever remember. We were protecting you. The family. The legacy. Protecting me? I exploded. The rage I had been suppressing for days finally tearing loose, white-hot and volcanic. You buried a stranger and told me it was my wife. You let me grieve for 20 years while she was alive and hiding from you. You stole her from me! You stole a mother from her child and a grandmother from hers. Robert, foolish as ever, tried to jump in. It was for the best. That woman, her background. And then to find out she had some secret child. It would have destroyed the company. It would have destroyed you. You destroyed me the day you decided you had the right to play God with my life, I snarled, leaning across the table, my face inches from his. The fight was brutal, their pathetic denials crumbling into selfish, prejudiced excuses about preserving the family name. It ended with me looking at the two men who shared my blood as if they were strangers, alien creatures I no longer recognized. You are no longer my family, I said, the words falling like stones in the shocked silence. As of this moment, you are cut off. The Vance name, the Vance fortune, you will have nothing. I will spend the rest of my life dismantling the very empire you were so desperate to protect from the stain of a woman you were never worthy of knowing. I turned and walked out, leaving the ruins of my family behind me. But I knew Robert. Cornered, vengeful and weak, he wouldn't go down quietly. The war was beginning. As I had predicted, Robert retaliated not with strength, but with the spite of a wounded animal. He leaked the story, but he twisted it, a master of malicious spin, painting me as the villain. The first headline came from a sleazy online tabloid known for its viciousness. Billionaire's secret. Vance hid illegitimate black granddaughter for years to protect fortune. Within hours, the storm hit. It was a hurricane of speculation, moral outrage, and the same thinly veiled racism Evelyn had always faced. Major news outlets, smelling blood, ran with it. The Vance deception. A legacy of lies. Empire in crisis. Jonathan Vance's hidden family. My face was everywhere, plastered next to a grainy, long-lens paparazzi shot of Amira walking to school. They called Evelyn a schemer, Maya an opportunist, and me a cold-hearted liar who had hidden his own family. The truth was irrelevant. The narrative was set. The corporate world reacted instantly and brutally. Vance Industries' stock plummeted in pre-market trading. The board, my board, called an emergency meeting. I walked into a room of panicked, furious faces, a mix of fury and fear. They weren't my allies. They were stakeholders protecting their investment. "You have to issue a statement, Jonathan," one of them yelled, his face red. "Deny it. Say the girl is a fraud. Whatever it takes. You need to contain this." "This is a personal matter," I told them, my voice like ice. It stopped being personal when it wiped $30 billion off our market cap. Another shrieked, "You have a fiduciary duty to this company. You have a duty to us. You need to cut ties with the girl and save the company. Contain this. Cut ties." They wanted me to throw a 10-year-old girl and her foster mother to the wolves to protect a stock price. They wanted me to dishonor Evelyn's memory and finish the vile job my father and brother had started. The pressure was immense, coming from every direction. My own lawyers, men I paid millions a year, advised me to publicly distance myself from Amira until a paternity test could be officially conducted. A process that would take weeks and leave her in a state of public limbo. My PR team drafted statements full of corporate non-apologies and vague promises. The world I had commanded for so long was turning on me, demanding I sacrifice the last, living piece of my wife's legacy for the sake of the bottom line. But the worst part, the part that cut me deeper than any stock market crash, was what it was doing to Amira. Paparazzi camped outside her modest apartment building. Reporters ambushed Sarah as she tried to take Amira to school, shouting questions about money and motives. The online comments were a digital cesspool of hatred and racism, all of it aimed at a little girl whose only crime was existing. Sarah called me one night, her voice breaking with a strain I could feel through the phone. Amira was having nightmares. She wasn't eating. She was being teased and ostracized at school. She was scared. "Maybe it would be better if we just disappeared for a while," Sarah said, her voice heavy with defeat. "I can't let her go through this. She's just a child, Mr. Vance." I felt a profound, suffocating shame. My world, my name, my fight had brought this hell down upon their innocent lives. I was on the verge of losing everything. My company, my reputation, and now, the only real connection I had left to Evelyn. That night, unable to bear the silence of the mansion, I drove to the cemetery. I stood before the polished granite headstone that bore Evelyn's name and the wrong date of death. It was a monument to a lie I had tended to with flowers for 2 decades. For 20 years, I'd come to this spot and spoken to a ghost. "What do I do, Evelyn?" I whispered into the cold night air, the words swallowed by the darkness. "I spent 20 years building an empire of steel and glass, and it's all turning to dust. I thought control was everything. I thought power was the answer. But it's not. It's just a cage, isn't it? A gilded cage." I looked at the false name on the cold stone. I thought of Evelyn, forced into exile, lonely and afraid. I thought of Maya, growing up with a hole in her heart where a mother should have been. And I thought of Amira, a little girl caught in a vicious storm she didn't create, clutching a faded photograph of a grandmother she never had the chance to know. And right there, standing before a lie carved in stone, I finally found the undeniable truth. My legacy wasn't Vance Industries. It wasn't the skyscrapers or the stock prices or the name feared in boardrooms. It was love. The powerful, resilient love Evelyn had been forced to hide. My ultimate responsibility wasn't to a board of directors. It was to a 10-year-old girl who had my wife's eyes and a brave, wounded heart. A sense of profound clarity washed over me, a peace I hadn't felt in 20 years. I finally knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to run or hide or contain anything. I was going to tell the truth, all of it, no matter the cost. The next morning, I called a press conference. I didn't hold it in the sterile corporate auditorium at Vance Industries, a place that reeked of greed and compromise. I chose the main hall of the city's contemporary art museum, the very place I had first laid eyes on Evelyn's work decades ago. A fiery, abstract canvas of hers had called to me from across a crowded room. A silent conversation that changed the course of my life. The room was now packed with the international press. Every major network was there, their cameras poised like a firing squad. The air crackled with a rabid, predatory anticipation. My board members sat in the front row, their faces grim, a jury already convinced of my guilt. My father and Robert weren't there. I'd had my personal security bar them from the building. I walked to the podium alone. I had no notes, no teleprompter, no army of lawyers whispering in my ear. When I looked out at the sea of faces, I didn't see reporters. I saw the world that had judged my wife, that had forced her into the shadows, and was now preparing to do the same to her granddaughter. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone to fill the vast, silent hall. For the last 20 years, you've known me as Jonathan Vance, the CEO, the billionaire, the man who has everything. Today, I'm here to tell you that man was a fraud. He was living a lie, a comfortable, wealthy, and profoundly empty lie. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. 20 years ago, I didn't lose my wife, Evelyn Vance, to an illness. I lost her to fear. I lost her to prejudice. I lost her to the cruel, calculated actions of my own family, who saw her love, her spirit, and her heritage not as a gift, but as a liability to their precious, sterile legacy. I laid it all bare. I told them everything. I told them about Evelyn's secret daughter, Maya, born when she was just a girl herself. I told them about her desperate search and the joy of their eventual reunion. And I told them about the monstrous, inhuman choice my family forced upon her. Disappear and let your husband and daughter live in peace, or stay and watch us use our immense power to destroy you all. They staged her death, I said, my voice dropping but gaining intensity, the words echoing in the silent hall. They buried a stranger and built a lie for me to live in. My wife, the brilliant, loving Evelyn Vance, did not die in 1994. She died 6 years ago, under an assumed name, alone in a small town. She was granted only a handful of secret stolen meetings with the daughter she could never publicly claim. I paused, letting the full weight of the monstrosity sink in. I could see shock registering on faces that I knew were usually impassive. The recent stories about my hidden family are correct about one thing. There is a little girl named Amira. She is Maya's daughter. She is Evelyn's granddaughter. But she is not a secret to be ashamed of. She is not a scandal to be contained. She is family. She is the last living piece of the woman I loved. And I have failed, until this very moment, to protect her from the poison of my own world. My voice grew stronger, filled with a righteous conviction that came not from my mind, but from my soul. The board of Vance Industries has urged me to distance myself from this child. Shareholders are panicking. They see this situation as a crisis. They are profoundly wrong. This is not a crisis. It's a reckoning with a past built on prejudice and a present that values profit over people, share price over simple human decency. I looked directly at the front row where my board sat, stone-faced. So let me be crystal clear. I will not be stepping down as CEO. I will be transforming my company from the inside out. And I will not be distancing myself from my family. I will be embracing them, finally and fully. At that precise moment, a side door opened. Sarah walked in, holding Amira's hand. Amira looked small and scared in the face of the blinding wall of flashing cameras, but she held her head high, her small shoulders squared. They walked to the stage and stood beside me. I reached down and took Amira's small, trembling hand in mine. It was a silent declaration, more potent than any words I could speak. I then held up a large, clear, high-resolution copy of the faded photograph for everyone to see, Evelyn and Maya, smiling in the sun. "This is not a picture of a scandal," I declared, my voice ringing with an emotion I no longer tried to suppress. "This is a picture of a mother's undying love, of a grandmother's legacy. It is the bridge from a past filled with pain to a future we will now build together. A future based on truth. Amira is my granddaughter. She is my family. Her story is my story. And if the world has a problem with that, then the world is the one that needs to change. Not us." I looked down at Amira. She squeezed my hand and, for the first time, gave me a small, brave smile. In that moment, surrounded by the blinding flashbulbs and the shocked faces of the world's media, I had never felt more powerful or freer. The press conference wasn't the corporate apocalypse my board had so grimly predicted. The story exploded, but the narrative had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer a juicy scandal about a billionaire's secret. It became a human story of love, loss, sacrifice, and redemption. Many people, it turned out, were moved by the raw honesty, by the powerful image of a man choosing family over fortune. Of course, the cynical critics were still there, calling it a masterful PR stunt to save my own skin, but their voices were largely drowned out by a surprising and overwhelming wave of public support. I made good on every single promise. I completely restructured the Vance Industries board, initiating a hostile takeover of my own company to oust the members who had told me to abandon Amira. I promoted a new generation of leaders, men and women, who understood that ethics and business were not, and should not be, mutually exclusive. My father and brother were legally and financially severed from my life and from the company their father had built. The Vance name no longer belonged to them. Their betrayal was a deep wound that would never fully heal. But I refused to let their poison infect my future, or Amira's. My most important work, though, happened far away from any boardroom. With Sarah's blessing, I formally adopted Amira, giving her not just my name, but the promise of a stable, secure, and loving home. Sarah, her amazing and resilient foster mom, remained an integral part of our new, unconventional family, a beloved aunt and confidant to Amira, and a dear friend to me. My cavernous, empty mansion, a place that had felt more like a mausoleum for 20 years, slowly started to feel like a home again. Laughter, Amira's laughter, echoed in hallways that had only known oppressive silence. Her artwork, vibrant, hopeful, and full of life, just like her grandmother's, began to fill the cold, empty walls, covering them with color and joy. A year later, we were standing on another stage. There were no flashing cameras, no hostile questions. We were at the official launch of the Evelyn Vance Foundation, a charity I had funded with a third of my personal fortune, dedicated to supporting young, under-resourced artists and providing legal and financial aid to families separated by adoption and social prejudice. The foundation's headquarters was the art museum where I'd first seen Evelyn's work. I had bought the building. I dedicated it, and its entire collection, to her memory. I stood at the podium with Amira, now a confident and poised 11-year-old, by my side. My late wife, Evelyn, used to say that art was the truth the world was afraid to tell. I said to the warm, supportive crowd of artists, donors, and families. She believed in its power to heal, to connect, and to challenge. This foundation is our promise to continue her work, to amplify the voices she always championed. When I finished, Amira stepped forward to the microphone. "My grandmother painted the sky," she said, her young voice clear and proud, ringing with a wisdom beyond her years. "Now we get to help other people paint their own." Later that evening, back home, Amira and I were standing by the fireplace in the study. The original faded photograph that had started it all now sat in a simple, elegant silver frame on the mantelpiece, replacing the old photo of Evelyn and me. It was no longer a symbol of a painful secret. Still, a testament to a truth finally brought into the light. The icon of our strange, broken, and beautiful family. I had lost an empire built on control, and, in its place, gained a world built on love. I finally understood that a true legacy isn't measured in billions or buildings, but in the lives you touch and the love you leave behind. Evelyn was gone, but for the first time in 20 years, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the presence of my granddaughter, she felt closer than ever. If this story of love and redemption moved you, let us know in the comments. What do you believe is the most crucial part of a person's legacy? Your stories and thoughts inspire us. For more tales that explore the depths of the human heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.